Pastor Nick gave me permission to preach a 1-hour sermon. Just kidding. Keep it short and sweet. So the title of this message is God is God. Now please stand now as I read tonight's scripture. Genesis 1:16 through 18. And God made two great luminaries, the greater luminary to rule the day, and the lesser luminary to rule the night, and the stars. And God placed them in the firmament of the sky to be light over the earth, and to rule the day and the night, and to separate between the light and the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Next is Exodus 7:19, 10:22 through 23, and 12:29. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, over their canals, and over their ponds, and over all their pools of water, so that they may become blood." Then there was blood over all the land of Egypt, and in the trees, and in the stones. So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky. There was an extreme darkness over all the land of Egypt for 3 days. Each person could not see his brother, and each person could not move for 3 days. But for all the Israelites, there was light in their dwelling places. Then in the middle of the night, God smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sat upon the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the beasts. And finally, Joshua 10:11 through 13. As they fled before Israel, while they were going down the slopes of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down huge stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the Israelites killed with the sword. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord, and the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to the Israelites. And he said in the eyes of Israel, "Sun over Gibeon, stand still, and moon over the valley of Ayalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stood until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Is it not written in the scroll of Jasher? And the sun stood in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to set for the whole day. Let us pray. Dear Lord, as I preach this message tonight on how you alone are God, please be with all of us and allow our hearts to be opened up to you. Help us all to gain a deeper understanding and love of your word. I pray that you be with me as I speak a message glorifying you, and then you help me convey everything that you want us to hear. Open our ears and our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. The title of tonight's sermon, as I mentioned, is God is God. Now, when you hear this title, I want you to think about Deuteronomy 7 through 11. In this passage, Moses is addressing Israel, and he reiterates to the Israelites by saying that it was God's mighty hand that redeemed them from the Pharaoh of Egypt. Moses tells the people, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God." Before I begin, I want to tell you a story about myself. A story about me relying on gods other than the actual God. And then my wife can also attest to this. When I was a child, I got very sick with cancer and I was treated at the University of New Mexico Hospital. This was in the 90s. The doctor in this hospital treated me and other children who had cancer with very outdated methods. As a result, a great number of the children who were treated at that time, along with me, died. Only a few of us survived. Because of this, there was a big lawsuit with the doctors and the hospital, and we were all rewarded a pretty big sum of money from the lawsuit. So, cut to when I turned 18, I was given access to my trust fund. This also is around the time when I met my now wife. I lived on this money for a long time. Then when my wife and I moved to Colorado, we lived on this money for years longer. However, though I was a Christian, this money became like a god to me. I did what I wanted, we traveled where we wanted, and we thought we were living a good life with no worries. Now I know what you're thinking, but we didn't do anything bad. It wasn't the freedom alone. It was the reassurance that we felt that the money was always there. The idea that as long as we had the money, all of our problems could be solved. But in reality, we fought constantly about the money. I felt that it was mine because it came from my experience. I felt that I had no reason to give a lot of details on the bank account that was mine. This caused trust issues between us, my wife and I. Then a few years later, the money ran out. We had spent it all, and we were both forced to rely on God more than we had ever done in the past. This money didn't save me, It didn't fulfill me. It didn't even bring me joy. My wife will agree to this. When the money ran out, when all the money was gone, our marriage and our lives improved significantly. We had honest conversations about finances. We worked together to make it through what we both would agree was one of the most difficult times in our marriage. It wasn't just us, though. God was there. We learned that God sometimes knocks people's idols down so that they rely more on Him. Oftentimes, we find ourselves praying for more money, for the newest gadget, or whatever else is on our minds. Our running out of money showed us who the true God was. I want us all to realize tonight that only God can save us, only God can fulfill us, only God is God. Now, the message that I chose to preach on tonight is over verses that we may have read a dozen times, or maybe this is the first time that you're ever hearing it. What I'm going to share with you is something that the vast majority of Christians have never even thought about before. Why did God inspire Moses to write these texts and many others to a specific people surrounded by foreign cultures and gods in the specific way that they are written? Why the mention of the sun and moon, the Nile, or hailstorms? Polemics is the answer. That is, a refutation or attack on the position of someone else. In this context, God is attacking the way of life, and above all, the gods of the neighboring peoples around Israel, whether they be the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Philistines, etc. The Old Testament is filled with polemical writings, and tonight we're going to examine some of them. Let's take a look at portions of the text again. Genesis 1:16. The creation of everything reads, "And God made two great luminaries, the greater luminary to rule the day, and the lesser luminary to rule the night, and the stars." Now you might be asking yourselves, what does this have to do with polemics? Isn't this just a recounting of how God created the universe? Well, yes, it is. But it's much more than that. It has another purpose that would have been very clear to its original Israelite audience. My hope this evening is that it'll be clear to us too. So what's going on here in Genesis 1? I want you to notice a few things about this verse. First, notice the word luminaries. This is very weird phrasing. When reading the whole section, it's clear that the luminaries are referring to the sun and the moon. But why is this odd? Here's why. Hebrew has a word for sun and a word for moon. So why didn't the author just use those? It's because in the ancient Near East, the world of the Old Testament, there are other gods whose names sound almost exactly like the Hebrew words for sun and moon. Now stay with me for a moment. I'm going to mention some Hebrew words because they're central to the understanding of this passage. The Hebrew word for sun is Shemesh, and the Mesopotamian sun god, who would have been known to the Israelites, was named Shamash. Likewise, the Hebrew word for moon is Yareach, and the Canaanite moon god, who also would have been known to the Israelites, was named Yarik. Notice the similarities in the name when I just say them. Shamash versus Shemesh, Yarik versus Yareach. And these are even more similar in written form. The reason that the author of Genesis uses luminaries instead of sun and moon is because he wanted to avoid any confusion by the Israelite people. He wanted to make sure that they knew that the sun and moon were just objects and not other gods, like the surrounding nations believed. Furthermore, the fact that God placed them in the sky shows that God has power over them all. Moreover, notice that at the end of Genesis 1:16, the author writes, "and the stars." It's like an endnote or a second thought. That's because it is. In the ancient Near East, stars were arguably more important than the sun or moon, and were often listed first in creation stories because they were believed to have magical powers. However, here in Genesis, the author does the opposite to show just how insignificant the stars are. God is in control, not the stars, not the sun, and not the moon. Now let's move on to Exodus. To give quick background information, the Israelites had just migrated to Egypt during the life of Joseph, son of Jacob or Israel, son of Isaac, son of Abraham. They lived in the land of Goshen alongside the Egyptians for many years. Eventually, Joseph died. The Pharaoh who Joseph befriended died, and a new Pharaoh arose over Egypt who did not remember Joseph's friendship with the house of the Pharaohs. This new Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites out of fear that they would rebel and take over Egypt. Now, this was not an irrational fear or unfounded, as the Egyptians had been previously conquered by a Semitic people, just like the Israelites, called the Hyksos, just a few hundred years before that. Eventually, though, a man named Moses, who was an Israelite raised in the Pharaoh's house, sought to lead his enslaved kinsmen out of Egypt into a land that was given to them by God. Now, it's during Moses' attempt to lead his people out of Egypt that the polemics come into play. In the story, Moses and Aaron, his brother, inflict 10 plagues upon Egypt, acting on behalf of God, because the Pharaoh had refused to let the Israelites free from their slavery. Every one of these 10 plagues was not only a punishment to Pharaoh, but also an attack on Egypt's gods themselves. For this sermon, I'm just going to focus on the first, the ninth, and the last plagues. In the first plague, God told Aaron to turn the water of the Nile into blood. The Nile River was the lifeblood of Egypt. Without it, crops couldn't grow, animals couldn't eat, they would become malnourished, people didn't get fed, and people couldn't drink the water. When Aaron turned the water into blood, this was a direct attack on the Egyptian god Hapi, who was revered all over Egypt. The Nile was his realm, and he was highly looked upon by the Egyptian people. He was a very high-level deity in their pantheon because he provided life to the people. His waters enabled the farming and the ability to sustain the empire. When Aaron did this using God's power, God was demonstrating to the Israelites and the Egyptians that it was not Hapi who was in control of the river, but Yahweh alone. Hapi was helpless against the God of Israel, our God. The ninth plague was darkness over all Egypt. This time, God used Moses to perform this sign. When Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, God caused an immense, intense darkness to take over the land. And the Hebrew actually says dark darkness, emphasizing just how dark it really was. It was so dark that they couldn't even see their hands in front of their faces. Now, we've all experienced this kind of darkness as kids, turning off the lights in a room and seeing how dark it was, or going down into a cave with a guide and then turning all the lights off. It's pitch black. Well, multiply that by 100, and you get the darkness that was felt in Egypt. So how do you cause Egypt to turn dark during the daytime? You cover up the sun. Egypt has more sun gods in their pantheon than most civilizations that I can think of. Re, for example, was a sun god who had enormous power and affected the life and the afterlives of the Egyptians. Aten is another sun god. In particular, he is the manifestation of the solar disk, the literal sun itself. He gave life and sustained nature. Atum, sometimes equated with Re, was the primordial sun god from whom all things came into being. And finally, there was Horus, who is often erroneously equated with Jesus. The two are very different. He's another sun god who came to represent kingship. All of these gods that we just went over are maximally powerful in Egypt. They are the strongest possible gods that you could think of, that the Egyptians could think of. But despite how powerful the Egyptians thought their gods were, they still were nothing compared to our God. Without any effort at all, he stopped the sun from giving light to the land of Egypt. The sun gods could do nothing to stop him from darkening their land. The final, most severe plague that God used was killing off the firstborn in all of Egypt, particularly aimed at the firstborn of the Pharaoh. Luckily, Moses had given the Israelites information how to avoid this grim fate. This plague was not just an assault on Egypt as a whole, but also a direct attack on Pharaoh himself. In the Egyptian religion, the pharaohs were gods themselves, gods in human form, not too dissimilar from the atheists or New Agers that we have today. Now, this is going to sound strange or foreign to us today because we worship one God who is triune, but this was considered normal for the Egyptians. Pharaohs were manifestations of the god of kings, Horus. This was the final step for God to demonstrate his sovereignty to the Israelites and the Egyptians. In the previous 9 plagues, God showed them that Egypt's gods were powerless to stop him from punishing them. And now he is targeting the chief god himself, the Pharaoh. When God kills his son, it is the ultimate polemic. It demonstrates to the Egyptians that their god king cannot even save his own child, who was also a god, against the might of the God of the Bible. Now let's look at Joshua 10, 11 through 13. In this story, Moses has died and has passed his leadership on to his protege, Joshua. Joshua is supposed to lead the Israelites into the land of Canaan, the land given to them by God, and drive out the Canaanite inhabitants. In one of the battles between the Israelites and the 5 Amorite kings, we get one of the clearest and best polemics in the entire Bible. But before I mention this polemic, though, I need to mention the Canaanite gods that are being targeted here. The first 2 we've already heard of, Yarik and Shamash, the sun and the moon god. The third, though, is Baal, the storm god. Now, you may have heard this name pronounced Baal in the common English way, but it's pronounced Baal. During this event, we read that Joshua is battling against his enemies. God gave them into his hands by raining hail upon the armies and then causing the sun and the moon to stand still. First, let's talk about the hailstones. For these Canaanite kings, Baal was one of their primary gods in their pantheons, who was renowned and worshipped because of his power, both as a warrior and over the weather. For them, it was Baal who made it rain, hail, or snow, or storm. However, on this day, God caused it to hail on Baal's followers, and there was absolutely nothing Baal could do to save them. It was Yahweh who was master of the skies that day, not Baal. When he commands the sun and moon to stand still by the power of God, God is attacking both Yarik and Shamash. They were supposed to protect their people, but they were powerless, couldn't even protect themselves. They were not in control of those celestial bodies. God was. What makes this event even more telling is that Shamash was not just the god of the sun. He was also the god of justice, the governor of heaven, earth, and all the lands, and the spirits of the dead, and the redeemer who gives protection. Shamash was supposed to be the great protector of his people, but he could not protect them against the God of the Bible. Again, God is demonstrating to his people and the Canaanites that he alone is God and all others are nothing. So what can we take away from this? What can we learn here? The number one takeaway that I want all of you to get from this is that God, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, is king. He is in control. He is sovereign over everything. There is nothing that he cannot do, and all other gods are nothing compared to him. The Egyptians and the Canaanites thought that their gods could protect them, that their deities were stronger than all the rest. But they were wrong. They could not even imagine the power that they would face, the power of God, the true God. They couldn't save anything, but our God can, and he can save you too. God did all of this so that the Israelites would finally hear, read, and see what kind of God he is. But he also did this so we would know what kind of God he is. He is a God who watches over his flock, and like a true king, will protect us and fight for us. So how can we relate this passage to our own lives? No one worships Baal, Re, Horus, Chemosh, Anat, or Astarte anymore, right? Monotheism has taken over. Well, in one sense, yes, but in another sense, no. We do have modern-day gods of our own in the form of people, like athletes, actors, scientists, or even pastors. And nothing against the pastors here, I'm sure they're really great. We look up to them, we worship them, we idolize them. But these are not gods, and this form of idolatry is not limited to only people. We, myself included, sometimes consciously or unconsciously worship things like wealth, fame, lust, success, and so on. What these things, whether they be people, concepts, or objects, have in common is that they represent what we think we need in order to be happy, what we think we need in order to be fulfilled. Oh, if I could just make this amount of money, or if I become as famous as Brad Pitt, I can reach the level of contentment that I've been seeking. In reality, these things are just as powerless as the ancient gods of the Canaanites, or the Egyptians, or the Mesopotamians. God defeated the ancient gods over and over again in front of the Israelites, but the Israelites still worship those gods, even though they knew they weren't real. We do this exact same thing. We know money's not a god, that technology is not a god, that people are not gods, but we worship them anyway. In 5,000 years, humans have not really changed that much. These gods are temporary shells. They represent fragmentary moments of bliss. But God, He is not temporary. God is not a fragment. God represents true happiness, contentment, and fulfillment. We must rely wholly on the God of the Bible because He is the master over the universe, and it is with Him that we are fulfilled. It is with Him that we experience true joy, and it is with Him that we can know peace, and it is with Him that we can inherit eternal life. This God, who utterly destroyed the pantheons of the ancient Near East, loved us so much that the Son came down to earth, fully human, to receive unimaginable punishments so that we could be forgiven, so that we could have all the opportunities to gain salvation through Him. Actors, doctors, football players, the TV, they are all nothing. I'm nothing. But God is everything. He is the sole sovereign Lord of all, and He wants a relationship with you. Now let me close with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that this is effective for our hearts and that we will place you above all other gods. I pray that we remember that you alone are God and that all other gods are false. Amen. Thank you for being here this evening.